Hi, everyone. It's so good to see you here, and thank you so much for joining. I'm really excited for this one today. With a background in operations and planning, project management is one of the most must have skills that always is like an obvious thing you need, but sometimes that best approach is a little hard to wrap your head around, especially with so many of the tools coming out. So, Jamie, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to diving into this conversation. Before we dive in, just a few housekeeping notes. So we are hosting this through StreamYard webinar. This session is being recorded and we'll share the replay after with all of you afterwards. Please do drop your questions in the chat as we go. You don't need to wait till the end. We'll be able to pull those questions in after, and feel free to just keep popping them in as those questions come up. I'll keep an eye on the chat and then we'll actually ask those questions at the end during the AMA portion. If you have any questions that you submitted during the registration, we have pulled those as well, and we will be asking those after Jamie has her presentation. So let's keep this simple. We're here to share what's actually working, what's not, and hopefully give you a few things to take away. Today's session is called Project Management for Mission-Driven Teams with Jami Yazdani from Yazdani Consulting and Facilitation. A quick overview on how today will run. So Jamie will kick us off with a short learning segment to frame things out. I'll guide a few curated questions based on what she's shared, and then we'll open up the floor to some of our live questions. And just as a reminder, this is a facilitated community first conversation, so please, please, please put those questions in the chat. So I'd love to introduce Jami. So Jami Yazdani is the founder of Yazdani Consulting and Facilitation, where she helps mission-driven leaders build collaborative teams with clarity and confidence. So their work creates meaningful impact. With more than 20 years of experience leading complex, high-impact initiatives and 14 years in higher education and library leadership, Jami brings both structure and empathy to the way organizations plan, collaborate, and lead change. Since launching her consultancy in 2018, she has partnered with nonprofits, associations, and purpose-driven teams to move from task overwhelm to confident, collaborative leadership. Her expertise has been featured in Trello, ClickUp, Reworked, and Smartsheet, and she has served on board leadership roles. Jami holds master's degrees in technology management and library information science, along with a project management professional, discipline agile scrum master, and change management certifications. She's passionate about equipping leaders with clarity, confidence, and calm to guide their teams forward. Jami, thank you so much, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. So, Nicole, can you help me share get my slides on the screen, please?
Absolutely. Let me just share screen.
Thanks, everybody. I feel like when you see AMAs on social media, people have some like cheap sign that they're holding up, and I always wonder, do they not have a printer or Canva? But anyway, so I have slides. So what I'd love to start with to kind of frame our discussion today is, what do we mean when we're talking about a project? And so the Project Management Institute actually defines a project very, very broadly as a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. And there really are kind of two important pieces to this that make a project a project. First, it's temporary. That could be a week, that could be 5 years, but it's something that we plan to end. And so that is what really separates it from our ongoing programs and services. And then we're creating something unique. Now, unique could be unique to the world. You are building something that no one has ever seen before. But often what we are actually doing is creating something that's unique to our environment. So other nonprofits may be offering a similar program, but you are building a program or a service for your community and your unique environment. And so that's what a project is, which is a pretty broad definition. But what is project management? And so PMI's definition is really, really broad. They say it's the application of knowledge, skills, tools, and techniques to project activities to meet project requirements, meaning you take strategies, you apply them to the work of the project to make the project successful. And that really kind of reflects their approach, which is kind of centered in the business world, business environments. But in nonprofit environments, success is often more than just on time and under budget. We definitely want our projects to be on time and under budget, but we also want to create really impactful outputs that align with our mission, that align with our values. And we also want to engage our community, engage our stakeholders to do that. And so I actually like to define project management a little bit differently. I believe it's facilitating collaboration to create impactful outputs in support of a shared purpose. And I think that really reflects what we're trying to do and what we're talking about when we're managing projects in our environments. And so how do we do this well? And I hope that's what we'll talk about most of our time together today in terms of answering your questions. But over the 20 or so years that I have been leading projects in mission-driven environments, there are a couple of things that I have found make managing projects more successful. And so I have a framework that I call the Clarity to Action framework, that has 7 components to it. And I really believe and have seen from making mistakes early on to sort of helping organizations lead better projects today, that if we focus on these things in our planning, but also in how we manage projects, they tend to be more successful. And I do believe these things are kind of simple in many ways, but I've found that the difference between sort of being overwhelmed by projects to being able to create that impact that we want isn't really about rigid planning processes. It's not about a project management tool, and it is 100% not about doing more with less. It's really about creating and maintaining clarity that is then going to lead to sustainable and impactful action. And so I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, but the 7 key elements are really having a clear vision and scope, anchoring your plan to your current reality, involving your stakeholders in a very clear way, focusing on communication and keeping it really intentional, making sure that you have clear deliverables that you translate into action, having a realistic schedule and milestones, and then adjusting and evolving as you move through the project. And so I do have a few tips in each of these areas that I'm going to share before we dive into the questions. And so I think one of the probably simplest things that you can do to make your projects run better is to have a very clear scope. And so I love to have a 1-sentence scope statement. Often when we apply for funding, or we're getting a project approved, we write kind of lengthy scope statements, but I found that having a 1-sentence scope statement, something we can put in an agenda, put in a report, that we can share with a broader group of stakeholders can really be helpful. And so the way that I like to write that 1-sentence scope statement that really creates a clear vision for folks of what we're trying to do, what success looks like, and why we're trying to do it can be helpful. And so I usually write it in this way, in support of some broader goal or mission. So I want to tie it to that big picture why. This project will take some sort of action. We're going to build something. We're going to research something. We're going to create something. Whatever that something is, that broader outcome come by a clear deadline. And so having this simple 1 sentence really can kind of get some buy-in and get people on the same page. Beyond scope, we also want to have really clear deliverables. And sometimes I find that folks confuse scope and deliverables. They're kind of conflated sometimes, but we want to have clear, concrete deliverables. And our deliverables are those concrete, tangible outputs that our project is going to create. And so if we have a scope where we're creating a new program, let's say, Folks might say, well, the deliverables, the program, but actually in a project like that, you are creating multiple things. Maybe we're doing an assessment of needs. Maybe we're doing a pilot program. Maybe we're creating content. Maybe we're creating marketing. And so all of those things would be deliverables for our project. And then what we do is use the deliverables to get to our list of tasks. That creates kind of a clear picture for folks. If you assign one task to me out of 100 tasks, and I understand that I'm supporting this deliverable, which is supporting this scope, it's easier for me to understand how I'm really supposed to engage with the project. But I see a lot of people go from scope to a list of 100 tasks, which is really hard to manage. It's hard to report on. Some tasks are more important than others. And so we really want to define our deliverables and break them into tasks. All right, and so the next thing is stakeholders, and we could talk about stakeholders for the full 45 minutes, but we do want to broadly and inclusively identify who our stakeholders are. And so particularly in nonprofit projects, we often have lots of different stakeholders with different needs, and we really want to make sure that we're engaging them. But to do that, we need to identify who they are. And so often when we're thinking about stakeholders, we think about the users we're going to serve and who's going to be on the project team. But there are a lot of other folks who may need to engage with your project. And so we want to think about who those folks are and then think about the role that they're going to play. So if you identify 100 stakeholders, they all don't need to be on the project team. And they may have roles that vary from being kind of very large roles, they are on the project team, to something that's very small. Maybe they just need to know that the project is happening. And so we really do want to think about who our stakeholders are and then determine a clear role for them. And probably most importantly, we want to plan for communication. I often see approaches to project management that if they even include communication planning, they include it sort of at the end as an afterthought. Communication is the most important thing to a project. You get nothing done. You can't get people to collaborate if you're not communicating with them. And so it really should be one of the first things that we plan for. We may sometimes plan for, let's say we are building a new program for a project, how we're going to communicate with people about that program launch, but we need to be communicating with stakeholders, our project team, our funders, our leadership, our volunteers, our board members throughout the project. And so once you know who your stakeholders are and what their role is, then you can really think about, well, what do they need to know about the project? How are we going to get them that information? And when are we going to share that information? And so I really encourage people to have a plan for how they are going to communicate about the project as one of the first things that they plan for. Schedule and milestones. Schedule is always tricky. What I can say is a couple of places where I see people struggle in projects is that they don't have enough time. And sometimes that's about funding. Sometimes that's about capacity. But if you are in a position to set a realistic schedule, everything takes longer than you think. It's hard to put a number to it, but I would actually estimate that projects typically should take about 50% longer than we think that they are going to. And so as much as you can, build an extra time, but also build decision points into your schedule. When I work with nonprofit teams, I often see that decision points in a project are where things get delayed. And so you get to a point where someone has to make a decision to move forward or to say that this is the final version of something, and things stall. And so if there are decisions people have to make, put them as tasks in your project and give them a due date and let the folks know who are going to make the decision that they need to make a decision at that particular point in the project. The other thing that we want to do is really anchor our plans in reality. And this is hard. This is hard for a lot of reasons because most of the time in nonprofit environments, projects are on top of everything else that you're already doing. And so you may already sort of be at capacity. I really encourage project managers to sort of talk to the people who are your stakeholders, who are going to be on your core team, and really talk through what is realistic. I may think that you should be able to do something in June, but I don't realize that, another program that you're leading has kind of their big event then. And so we really do, when we come up with a schedule, when we're coming up with lists of tasks, we want to say to the folks involved, is this something that you can actually do? Is this realistic? And if it isn't, can we play with the schedule? Can we shrink something? Can we bring other people in to help? But we also want to talk with folks about what they can stop doing. And so is there something they can take off their plate? Is there something in the project that maybe someone else can be doing? And so we really do, I often say that project plans are aspirational, but we really want to make them as realistic as possible. And then finally, we do, even if you talk to your team, you've got a pretty realistic plan and you start to move forward, things change. Maybe needs change in your community. Maybe the folks who thought the schedule was realistic are doing other things or get other jobs. And so we often do have to make changes. And so if we do make changes, that's okay. We just need to communicate them to folks, communicate to the folks who are impacted. And I often tell new project managers, because often when we're thinking about project management, we're kind of trying to get to this perfect plan. That is not the goal. The goal is usable outputs. We want what our project creates to be successful. And so if we have to change our perfect plan to do that, then we have to change the plan to do it. And so don't be afraid of making changes, just communicate them. So that was a super quick introduction, a super quick kind of list of tips around these 7 areas that I have found are most helpful. And so I'm ready to take questions that you have, either about any of the things that I've talked about or about other things that I haven't talked about. So I'm gonna, stop sharing. Thank you.
That's amazing. Jami, that was super helpful. I think I can see so many of the connective tissues throughout all of those pieces and so many of the projects that I'm currently working on right now. So just that framework alone, I think, was super helpful. And I think there's a lot of ways that people can start connecting it directly to their work. So thank you so much for that. So I'm going to pull a few questions that came through during registration because there were some really great consistent themes across the board there, especially around where to start, how to stand out, and honestly, how to not waste your time. So before we jump in, do be sure to check out Jami's resource on the Clarity to Action framework. You can get that yourself. I will share the link with everybody in the follow-up email as well, but please do be sure to check that out. So the first question I have is around what it actually looks like. So for teams doing mission-driven work, what does good project management actually look like, especially when capacity is limited and everything feels urgent?
Yeah, so I think what it looks like is an intentional approach. And so I think often what happens is we think if we get the right folks in the room, magic will happen. And I've never found that. I mean, unless you have a team, that is always working together and has done something similar 100 times before, magic just doesn't happen. And so I think we need to be really intentional, and we need to be intentional about communication. And so I think communication, again, as I said, is often the thing people kind of forget to think about, but it is the most important piece to leading projects well, is to really plan for communication. And so when it does work well, you have got people who understand their purpose, they understand how they need to contribute to a project, they have the resources and time to contribute to it. And when problems arise, there's enough kind of trust, which often comes from transparency and communication, for people to really work together to either handle the challenge or to make a change, to say, well, we thought we were going to do this, but we need to do that. So let's figure it out together. And so I think that intentionality is what gets us to good projects.
I love that. And I think what you said earlier, add 50% more time to your project planning, was eye-opening to me, as hard as that is to hear. It just feels true though, because I think you can always assume that there's going to be a hurdle or a hiccup that comes up.
Well, I mean, it's been, I just think the problem with that, and I can say that add 50% more time. The problem is that you've promised your funder you're doing it in 6 months. That's where we really hit against a challenge. And we also, other things come up, right? And so even if we felt that we made a really good schedule and gave people enough time, we didn't anticipate the other opportunity, the kind of emergency in the community that we're serving, the new, kind of thing that came out of the strategic plan. And so things just take longer, because I think often people ask me, well, how do I know how long a task takes? And I first say, well, ask the person who's going to do it. Because I don't know, as a project manager, you're not the expert on the work, right? And so ask the people, but then just assume it's going to take longer than that.
I think it's a great resource there. And you mentioned things come up, obviously. There's people wearing multiple hats. There's a lot that many organizations are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So how do you build project management practices within the team, or even emerging leaders who don't have formal training in it?
So this is work I often do with organizations, right? Because people often come to me and say, we want to kind of improve the way we're managing projects or improve the way we're collaborating. And sometimes training is good, right? Sometimes it's like, well, let's teach some people some strategies and they can apply them. But what I've found that is usually helpful first is to really get a sense of, what does a project mean in your organization? I gave you some definitions that were very, very broad, and they're broad for a reason. But what is a project in your organization? Where would project management training and tools and practices help? And you don't really know that until you've had some conversations about it. And then I usually like to figure out, well, what are people already doing that's working? What are the challenges, and what are the things that we could kind of apply to those challenges? And so, I think something that I often see, which is why I have the framework that I have. I was leading projects for more than a decade before I got my PMP. The PMP is wonderful. PMI has lots of strategies, but their approach is to give you 1,000 strategies, right? Because they want you to be able to apply it to your environment. And your environment could be, they're training people in construction and nonprofits and technology and educate, they're training a broad swath of people. I've really found that there are just a handful of things that are most useful in the type of environments that we're working in. But some of them are more useful in some nonprofits than others, right? And so you kind of have to figure out what's going to work in your environment, get people on the same page about that, and then you can kind of train them on what's gonna work.
That makes a lot of sense. And the PMP course or the whole program it is broad. There are a lot of different approaches that you can take. So I think being able to have somebody to know where to go and hone in makes a lot of sense. So I'm curious, with the actual day-to-day operations and longer term strategic projects or plans, how do you manage that pull between the day-to-day and the planning when both feel equally important?
Yeah, so this is really tricky. And I think this is one of the things that makes project management hard in nonprofits. And it's also the thing that makes a lot of the tools not work as well. And so, in for-profit environments where they're using tools and they're using techniques, they're using it for pretty much everything they do every day, right? In nonprofit environments, that's often not the case. We're trying to manage a project or 2 or 3, but we also have all of these ongoing programs, ongoing operations. And it really is, so you're not in a tool seeing everything that you're doing, right? It's like, okay, well, Asana's telling me I have 5 tasks today for these 2 projects I'm on, but I also have 15 things for the program that I run and the fundraising campaign that's coming up. And so that is a real tension. And I think some of this is hard at the individual level to do. It really needs to kind of be an organizational discussion about what the priorities are. And so I think often when we, and this may be a more philosophical answer than people wanted, but I don't think we spend enough time thinking about capacity. And when I talk to project managers, because I do a lot of training, and people kind of come to me with their challenges, and often the challenge is capacity. And so they do not have enough time, and the people that they're working with do not have enough time to really give to a project because they have everything else that they're doing. And so I think the answer is not, you know, a Pomodoro technique or whatever the time management stuff is. The answer is really at the organizational level, that we need to be having conversations that when you do a strategic plan and list 17 initiatives, what are you going to stop doing to do those initiatives? And so, you know, unfortunately, it's more of a leadership discussion. But I think a lot of times when we're planning for a project or trying to get funding for it, we're thinking about the opportunity, but we're not thinking about what's already happening in the organization. And we're not necessarily comfortable saying, well, we're going to stop doing this other thing. I think that's really hard, because all of that's the challenge. All of the things are important.
That's it.
None of the things are unimportant. And all of the things probably are creating an impact, right? They're helping someone in your community, someone that's a user or stakeholder for your nonprofit. It's all important, but there's only so many hours in the day, and people only have so much energy and attention. And so it really comes back to prioritization. So what is more important today? And I will say that sometimes I have a client right now, very large, impactful project. The people who were on the core team were told responsibilities were taken away from them so they could be on the team. So they knew they had, 10 hours a week to devote to the project. That made the project easier. Not everyone's willing to do that. But so, yeah, I wish I had a simple answer, but I think the answer is often kind of at a leadership level and a prioritization level.
I think you're right on, though. And if leaders aren't willing to remove certain tasks and they're not willing to expand their team, and they're currently working with the team that they have, I think that is a reality. Otherwise, you're going to burn people out too, and that's going to hurt you in the long run, and your mission and your goals for your organization. So this ties into that question too, and it's more around like the tools. So there's so many out there. What actually makes them work for the team, and where do they fall short? And then I'm curious as well, what are some of the tools that are working best that you've been seeing in the nonprofit space? Sorry, it's kind of a multiple question there.
Yeah, no. So there are lots of tools out there. And what I will tell you is I feel like they're all essentially the same.
Okay.
So, and you can have one that looks more like a spreadsheet. You can have one where the unicorn flies across, which is really fun, which is actually a thing. If none of you have used Asana, the unicorn flies across, which is fun. I like that. That's fun. But they're all essentially task management tools. Yes, they have some other functionality, but they are essentially about determining task and schedule and communicating it to your team. And yes, they'll pull analytics and all of those things, but they're all essentially the same. And I think there are two things that make them work well in organizations. One is thoughtful implementation. And so what I often see is folks will say, oh, well, we're having trouble. Let's buy Asana, or, well, we've been using ClickUp, but maybe Smartsheet is better. They're all, I firmly believe they're all the same. I mean, sometimes one may integrate with something better, and you may really like the unicorn, but they're very, very similar. And I've never seen them solve a team collaboration challenge. So there's that. But it's implementation. So I do think people say, oh, well, we purchased the license to Asana. Good luck. And people don't know how to use it. And because these tools really are impacting how people are collaborating, how they're managing their time in the day, I think you need to give a little bit of time to implementation and how people are actually going to use it. And how it's going to fit in the ecosystem of the other things that you're using. And so if you're also using Slack and Teams and stuff's on a Google Drive, and your meeting notes are coming out of Zoom, how is it really going to integrate? So I think it needs more thoughtful implementation than sort of here's your login. But the other thing I think, and I mentioned this maybe a little bit before, is that one of the challenges to implementing project management tools is that the rest of our work isn't in the tool. So it's just the project, right? Like if let's say we've got 2 projects running and we're using Asana or ClickUp, or I see someone says Priority Pilot and Basecamp in the chat, whatever it is you're using, that's great. But if most of my work, if 80% of the work I'm doing isn't in that tool, it just becomes this other thing that I have to look at, right? And also a lot of folks are not going to use the tool, and I don't just mean internally, but you may have board members on a project team, you may have volunteers, you may have partners. Are they really going to log in to whatever tool you're using? And so it may just be that it's you and a handful of folks using it, but then that's where the communication planning comes in. How are you going to let them know about things? And I see Glenn is saying thoughtful adoption, implementation, and is critical. Do it as a project. And I would agree. That is absolutely, it's a project in and of itself. Even if people can figure out how to use it, they really need to think about how it's going to impact their way of working and how you're going to integrate it into the workflow.
Yeah, that makes sense. And this next question, I think, ties into it quite nicely. And you may have answered some of it, so apologies for that. But like, how do you strike that balance between enough structure to stay organized without creating systems that overly complex or that are too hard to use?
So I think you strike the balance by creating a system that actually is customized to your team and your organization and your needs. So I think that's one of the things with tools, but a lot of times it's with frameworks or approaches, is we want to take, some approach that we've heard about or someone else is using and just sort of bring it into our organization. But it was designed for that other organization or a nonprofit that's slightly different than yours, or a business somewhere. And so I think we really need to figure out what the challenges are for your teams, for your project managers, and you could just ask them, right? So spend a little time asking them. And then I think the least amount of structure that you can get away with is the way to do it. And so often when I do like assessments with organizations, and often they've come to me because they are trying to implement a tool and the implementation isn't working. Right. And so if people aren't using it and they don't know why. And when I start talking to them, it was never that they needed a tool or that they needed some better way of doing their scheduling. Often it's that they don't know how to make decisions after they've gotten a bunch of feedback from folks. So they want to include people, which we absolutely should, but then how do you make a decision? Sometimes it's that they're just not having good meetings. Their meetings are ineffective. So sometimes it's not at all about the structure or the process or the framework. It's about how we're working together and sort of how people are showing up. And so it may be the smallest, kind of the smallest tweak to what you're already doing is really the answer. And I don't think a lot of rigid structure usually is what people want.
No, I would agree with that. And I think there's something like, we always think a tool can solve it. There's so much great technology. AI can solve it. And go ahead.
Oh, and it may sound like I'm down on technology. I'm not. I use all of these tools. I use these tools myself. I help organizations use these tools, but they're often not the answer to every problem, and especially if they're not implemented well. But it's often something very simple that we can tweak, like have more productive meetings, and that's
listening to your colleagues.
Right. Well, just I do the decision challenges with who makes a decision, how a decision is made comes up a lot. And there aren't always easy answers to that, but it's something we need to figure out as an organization. before things can move forward.
It makes complete sense. So there's a lot of conversations with AI, the tools, all of those great resources. But I'm curious, how or where are you actually seeing it be useful within project management, AI specifically, and where is it overpromising?
So, a lot of tools. So, if you are using tools, most of them have, AI implemented in them in some way. And so, some of them allow you to kind of give it information and it will create a schedule for you or a plan for you. Typically, you have to tweak it. And I do think AI, much like nonprofit leadership, overestimates your ability to meet a difficult schedule, or underestimates how much time something's going to take, and so often you have to tweak it. But I do think it's great at giving first drafts of a project schedule or task list. It's good at that. I think in a lot of tools, the reporting elements are becoming really useful. And so it can kind of alert you to challenges it's seeing. It can kind of pull data out of, kind of your tool on what's happening in a project. And so I think those can be really useful time savers. I don't know that people are necessarily, I'm not hearing a lot of over promising. What I don't believe is that project managers will go away. I think when people think project management is just managing a schedule and a task list, yes, frankly, AI and a lot of the tools can do that. But what they can't do yet, and I'm not sure they're ever going to be able to do it that well, or I kind of hope they don't, is facilitate that difficult meeting with board members and volunteers and whatever, where you're making a decision. They're, not going to be able to help someone kind of figure out what they're going to stop doing so they can do the work. All of those things that are really the core of what project management is. I don't see the tools being able to do that, but who knows when my robot overlords are making me pick the vegetables or whatever. Who knows? You can bring up this conversation.
Yeah. And a lot of times it is people first. Like, we're in the world where we work with people, and I think that likely won't go away. And I agree with you. I hope it doesn't. I'm going to pull some questions from the audience, and there's some really good ones in here. So Trent has asked a question here, and he's curious about what the most common reasons projects stall in mission-driven orgs, even with a plan, and what's your go-to move to reestablish clarity and ownership. And I know you've touched on this a few times about like some hurdles that you continuously see. Sorry, but I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, so I definitely think they stall at decision points. And so, as I said before, thinking about the decisions that need to be made, including them in the plan, giving time for decisions too, and thinking about what information people need to make a decision. I sometimes see things stall even in the planning phase in terms of what the deliverables are. And so sometimes we've started a project with an idea or a need that we're trying to meet, but we don't actually know what we're creating. And so then you're kind of fumbling along and having lots of conversations that don't go anywhere. And so I do think getting really clear on what the deliverables are, not that you can't change them if something else comes up, but having those discussions early on, this is what we're going to be creating. Is this what people think we need to be creating? And then moving forward, I also see, kind of not having clear roles as being a challenge. And so people kind of don't know what they're supposed to be doing. They don't really know how they're supposed to show up, or we're not including the right people. And so I kind of feel like with that, people either put too many people on the project team when some of those folks do need to be involved, but kind of need to be involved at a more minimal level, right? Or they don't put enough people on because they don't want to deal with more people. They're trying to move quickly. But then they realize that someone from communications needs to do something and they didn't even know the project was happening. And now you're stalling. So I think kind of getting that clarity around what the scope is, what the deliverables are, having conversations about what roles people are going to play and communicating that, having discussions about it. Is really the way to go.
Yeah. I've seen it a few times in past workspaces where it felt like broken telephone and people being very surprised that communications is usually the group that feels surprised because everything has to go through them in the end.
Yeah.
Um, so I think, yeah, having those bigger conversations is so important. So I know we also talked about this a little bit, and you said that people won't necessarily be in the project management tool, but do you have any suggestions or advice on how you can get others on board that need to be in there in those project management tools? And if it's a flying unicorn,
Yeah.
maybe.
So what I would ask is, do they really need to be in there? I mean, truly, right? Like what I think you need to go back to what is the information they need to know to engage with the project and do whatever it is you want them to do. And then once you know that, well, how is the best way to get that to them? The easiest way for you might be the project management tool, but is it the best way for them to get the information? And I know that that takes more time. I know that as a project manager, that takes more time to think about, well, I'm going to have to pull information out and send it to the board. I think, I have worked with organizations where we're getting boards to use tools, and just like everyone else, it needs thoughtful implementation, you need training, you need support. And often it's only something you want to do if they're needing to be engaging with it a lot, either in a project, a lengthy, big project, or there are multiple projects. But often you can just send them the information they need via email if that's the only way that they're going to look at it.
And I think it ties back into your budget more time because you are going to have to take more time probably communicating, doing those follow-up responses, making sure that everybody's in the loop. I think that is also an the time constraint for that is often underestimated.
Well, and I think that is really communication is what the project manager's primary role is.
Yep.
We think it's coming up with a schedule. We think it's tracking tasks. It is communicating and making sure everyone can engage with the project in the way that we need them to. And so that's what we need to be budgeting our time for.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I do have one last question that came in through the actual registration process, and it's a little specific, but I'm curious: are there specific considerations or best practices when managing grant-based projects, where timelines, reporting, and accountability are critical?
And so I know it sounds like I'm beating the same drum, but again, over more than 20 years of doing this is what I see. This is where the communication planning becomes really important. Your funder is a stakeholder, a key stakeholder. And so what information do they need? What are their requirements? When are you going to have to send a report to them? What does the report need to look like? Things like that. Those are the things that you want to think about at the beginning. And so consider them a stakeholder, plan for what they need, how you want them to engage. The other thing I would say too is just look at that stuff early, right? And so if there is let's say that there's a report they need quarterly, I would use that report as the template for all of the other reports that I'm giving, right? And so that would be kind of the primary thing. And can you use something similar for the board when you're presenting to them or the leadership? Really kind of make those things primary. And then, because usually in your organization, unless you have very rigid rules internally, what the report looks like may not be as important as it is for the funder. So I think trying to determine what those things are first and really incorporate it into your planning is the best way.
That's brilliant, and I think it makes a lot of sense, like, why you have like, replicating something makes it so much easier to make it automated and just an easier process across the board. So I really appreciate you sharing all your brilliance with us today. I think this is a conversation that we could continue to have, and there's so many more questions that we could dive into. But I think what you've shared is really helpful, and that framework that you provided gives very clear, actionable steps on how they can implement this into their own organization. So thank you for sharing that. Again, if you haven't had an opportunity to download that, we will share that link after in our follow-up email. So please be sure to look for that. And again, just thank you to everyone who joined us live and brought us such thoughtful questions. It really makes this conversation what it is. So thank you so much. And if this has sparked any ideas, please be sure to check out some of our other AMAs and upcoming Hive events. Thanks, everyone. I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks,
Thank
Jami.
you.